So Rohan's going to be talking about scientific and engineering language in context and a more general theory of discourse. So put your hands together for Rohan Mcleod. Thanks, Rohan.
I'm just using general theory of discourse because, for lack of a better title, but if you come from a scientific or engineering background and you encounter philosophy, certainly my experience was, first of all, what apparent scholasticism of philosophy, and secondly, the ambiguity that you come from a culture where the discourse is fairly easy, and the issue I hope that perhaps people would, I'd hope that those more predisposed to inquiry than debate might ask themselves is, how is it that scientific and engineering discourse is so clear, and philosophy, whatever that might mean, is so plagued with ambiguity? And here's a theory which I've called a general theory of discourse for lack of a better title at the moment. There's no attempt here to distinguish between technology and engineering. By technology and engineering, I mean the whole process of invention, design, construction, development of material and intellectual artefacts. It's quite a simple theory. I mean, these are sort of fairly obvious sorts of things, and you probably sort of say, well, yes, I know that, so what? Firstly, as a subject becomes more difficult, there's a tendency for one's words to miscommunicate the intended meaning of one's listener, of one's listener or reader, due either to obscurity. The word contains no meaning, or it's ambiguous. The word conveys many meanings and is misleading. The partial list of the ways a subject matter, what we mean by the word difficult, would seem to include complex versus simple, general versus particular, subtle versus obvious, implicit versus explicit, subjective versus objective, what exists versus what should not. So, all things being equal, it would be expected, for example, that discussing the location of the local post office should result in less miscommunication in the above sense than discussing some scientific, philosophical, metaphysical or mystical matter. The order of there is actually important. I'm suggesting that scientific matters will be less difficult than philosophical, and philosophical less difficult than metaphysical. Metaphysical, I'm meaning relations between subjective and objective, and mystical, I'm intending statements that are essentially about subjective experience. And in point of fact, we have, in mysticism, statements, Lao Tzu, that, those who speak cannot know, those who speak cannot know. So essentially that there are things which are intrinsically indescribable. I'm agnostic on that. But of course, things are not equal. Any two people will experience greater or lesser miscommunication in the above sense, depending on both the difficulty in the above sense and on what I term their degree of linguistic commonality. It's a commonplace, I think, that we take it for granted that if a speaker has only an English vocabulary and the listener has only a French one, communication will be difficult or impossible. So the idea arises that there may be other matters about which there also needs to be agreement, even though the requirement, like French or English, is optional. And perhaps there's an ordering of such agreements so that one is a prerequisite for the next. So here's what seems like a partial sequence of such agreements. Is it agreed that words will only be used literally, not metaphorically? If so, is it agreed that responsibility for disambiguation of words rests with the speaker or with the listener or somewhere in between? If so, is there an agreement regarding what words ontologically are? If they are symbols, what ontologically is a referent of a symbol? If so, is there agreement regarding the utility of definitions to the end of defining the meaning of words? For example, Wittgenstein might not have agreed with that. He didn't seem to have a notion of definition as something other than selection of usage by context. And if so, is there an agreement concerning the linguistic form of definitions? I mean, for example, in science, we perhaps have a notion of definitions should be concise, precise, exhaustive, and reductive. Concise meaning use a minimum number of words, precise being as unambiguous as possible, exhaustive as in including all intended usages and excluding all others, reductive as in not using words more or as complex than that being defined. If so, is there agreement that the definition doesn't merely describe an arbitrary category? And this sort of includes people who would sort of say, oh, well, it all depends on how you define X. It's your definition, there's your definition versus my definition. Again, there needs to be agreement on that. Is there agreement on whether words are not just a natural phenomena, but also a social artefact? You'll find some people from linguistics who will simply regard language, in particular words, as a natural phenomena. They're not something which you can ask, what is the purpose of this? The rock that you pick up out of the river, obviously, you can't ask what is the purpose of this. It's meaningless. But if I pick up a stone axe out of the river, you start to speculate on whether it's actually a stone axe or something else, a kind of a tool. If there's agreement on that, is there agreement on whether words are not just a natural phenomenon? Is there agreement that in natural language the category so described is not arbitrary as, say, a legal definition, but that it's an attempted ontological description? I mean, if you think about if you think about scientific definitions and the way that the words are defined, that we have these defined usages, and what those definitions are. I mean, we often just use them and don't think about, how did that definition come about, and how is it that it's so, generally accepted? As mentioned, this seems like a partial list, and the further criteria might become evident, and perhaps the ordering is tentative as well. And it's very important to emphasise that the above path is just one path through a binary tree of 256 possibilities. Where progress along the path, each path is only indicative of reduced likelihood of miscommunication, and that just because there is some likelihood of miscommunication does not mean there will be substantial agreement between speaker and listener. I may have substantial reservations regarding the existence of angels, but the theologian and myself will be communicating. The positivist philosopher may have substantial reservations regarding the utility of meditation, but again, she and the mystic, I'm just using she, and the mystic will be communicating. So finally, it's also contended the above path would be typical for speaker and listener pairs with a common background in science and engineering. Whilst the subject matter was limited to science and engineering matters, it becomes clear then why such communication is so void of semantic confusion. Namely because objective falsification has imposed very strict constraints on what the desired linguistic forms of definitions are considered to be and what those actual definitions will be for mass, length, time, energy, etc. This is just in conclusion. In some ways, I think the program of positivism and analytical philosophy can be seen as a hope to eliminate the ambiguity and miscommunication so common in perhaps not so much Greek, but in continental philosophy. But this Procrustean approach seems to have the unfortunate collateral result of excluding most subjects of interest in philosophy: ethics, ideology, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, and mystical and spiritual experience. So the takeaway, I hope, is that we start to realise why philosophy is if you're coming from a scientific and technical background and you're not just simply dismissing it as a whole lot of waffle, why it is so difficult. There ends the talk. Queries, theories?
So from the talk, I gather that you're saying that the two different communities, for example, I'm using science and the public as an example, and word theory. Word theory in the scientific community means something different than to the public. And when a scientist communicates a theory to the public takes it as an idea, a suggestion, whilst a scientist means it's more concrete, more factual. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, it's much more. I mean, yes, it includes that, but I mean, you know, why? I mean, when you start to deal with, I was interested in Eastern religions, and the problem of language, you know, was what sort of put me off in the end. And when I came to linguistics to try and sort of ask these sorts of questions about language, I found nothing. I read popular books on linguistics, and there seemed to be nothing there about. I guess that would be the two questions I would add at the end of it. Perhaps it's a theory. This is what this is. Is the theory false? And I suppose the second question would be whereabouts. Sorry, go on.
Is it a theory?
It is. It's a theory. Yes, it's definitely.
I was thinking that that's more of a hypothesis.
Well, I don't distinguish between.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. A theory for me is just something which is falsifiable. I use theory for something which is falsifiable. Standpoint as something which is you can have there's alternatives to it. You can view the horse from one side or from the back, sort of thing. They're equally viable. Value judgments I consider are just existential choices. So a theory just means it's in some way falsifiable. You can have a philosophical theory or epistemological theory or a scientific theory, etc.
See, myself, I'm from a chemistry background.
Yeah.
And theory means an idea, a way of testing forward and back and predicting future events and confirming previous experiments based on fact, and a body of evidence that supports this. And I see what you're saying, you're using as a theory as a hypothesis. It could be falsifiable, I don't know, it's a question. I can form a hypothesis, then go and test it. And whatever comes out of the test refines the theory. The two different points between a different language, for example, French and English, is a more drastic example of that. But in society today, I see a more subtle one between the general public's view of certain words and certain groups' way of viewing certain words, even between, for example, science and the general public, religion and general public as well. Each group of people has their own meanings and their own refinements of words, which they use, and when they try to communicate that to other people, miscommunication happens and confusion happens between them.
Yeah, well, it doesn't, I mean, this sort of theory doesn't, it's a bit like chaos theory, basically. Chaos theory doesn't actually tell you how to get a conclusion out of chaos. It just says this system is chaotic, so it's going to be hard to predict the result. That's how I interpret it anyway. And what this does, it sort of says, well, if you can go along a lot of steps along this way, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to talk meaningfully with this person from some other area of knowledge. You may not reach agreement, but at least there'll be communication. You know, as I was sort of saying.
Yeah, a level playing field will have to be formed in order for you to come in as basically from the same level of communication to communicate ideas at that point. So if you're coming from, say, from one side and another, you'll have to come in on equal footing and define what each word means.
Well, I mean, this is the whole point. I mean, yes, it's very common. If you come, that's sort of, you'll come to philosophy. I mean, I think you'll come to philosophy with that sort of notion. You've got a notion of what a definition is. But in philosophy, you'll come across people and you say, oh, could you define what that means? And they'll give you a stream of consciousness description. It's a listing of things, and you'll go, that's not what a definition is. And so the whole point is that was a binary tree that I was giving you. At each point, there was yes or no. I wasn't dealing with a no, I was just dealing with the yes. So that's why there's 256 different paths through it. And I haven't even, thought out what the other... for example, if you've got I think if you speak Mandarin or Japanese, there is a tendency for the listener to contextualise words. You'll decide that the word means this or that, and whereas in English the tendency tends to be more explicit. I've spoken to, I've dealt with people who were writing English and they were translating from Japanese, and I'd say, no, you have to put in A's and B's, and it was quite clear that they knew, whether it was A or B, but they were leaving it out because it was natural for them to put it in there contextually. So, I mean, you've already got a division there. If you consider the obligation is on the speaker to make it clear, then if your point of view is no, it's not really. It's for the listener. And I mean, I find a lot of continental philosophy, they seem to have that sort of an attitude, particularly in postmodernism, where it seems to be implied that you will make sense, or you will disambiguate what the speaker or the writer is saying. And the whole point is not that one's right or one's wrong. I mean, if you come from a scientific point of view, you'll say, well, it's bananas. You define what you mean, but I'm saying that one way of looking at this, because it's sort of I think in some ways language it's not just a subject of philosophy, it's a prerequisite of philosophy. You really have to, you need some sort of linguistic sophistication as you approach it, because you're going to have a lot of these sort of issues, you have to sort out. Sorry.
Right. So, put your hands together for Rohan. That was awesome. Thank you very much. Cheers. We'll have plenty of time for further disagreement during the break.